What's up guys, Phil here, and today I want to talk about swords. Well, not just swords, I'm actually going to talk about a variety of weapons, particularly unique weapons originating in India. Throughout history, India has created some of the most unique weapons of war to ever grace the battlefield. Their creativity when it came to warfare was astounding, yet most people don't know much about them. There's very little information to be found on these weapons unless you really know where to look, so I wanted to make this video to gather up as much information as I can and release it in a concise and hopefully entertaining way. Now, I'm not a historian or anything, I haven't formally studied this topic other than some intro medieval history classes in college, but I love medieval history and I love learning about it in my free time. And medieval Indian arms and armor is one of my favorite topics to learn about, because in India, weapons were much more than just weapons. They were often intrinsically tied to culture and religion, making them much more significant and interesting to learn about. So today, I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite Indian weapons, teaching you about their history, their function, their effectiveness, and their significance. I did a ton of research for this video and I'm super excited to talk about it, but first a disclaimer. I tried figuring out how to pronounce most of these things, but some of this stuff is literally in Sanskrit, so if you're some absolute psychopath who actually knows how to speak Sanskrit, please don't kill me for mispronouncing Vajramushti. Now with that all out of the way, let's get right into it. So the first weapon that I'll be talking about today is the Khanda. Compared to other weapons I'll be talking about later, this one's pretty tame. It's a two-handed, double-edged straight sword, and at first glance it looks pretty normal, but once you start taking a closer look, you notice some weird things. For one, the blade is super wide. I mean, just look at it compared to common European longswords. Then you notice the metal rib running down the edge of the blade. Like, what's the point of having a double-edged blade if you're just gonna cover 75% of one side of it? Maybe weirdest of all, the blade flares out instead of tapering, making the tip of the blade almost flat and making thrusting basically useless. So why would they do all this? Were they just, like, really bad at making swords? Well, in a way, kind of. The Khanda is one of the oldest prevailing weapons in India's arsenal, originating all the way back in the 4th century during the Gupta Empire, so they hadn't quite hit their stride with weapon design yet, but it's still an effective weapon. So effective, in fact, that it became somewhat of a cultural symbol, being the primary weapon of most Indian armies for over 1,000 years, with only minor improvements here and there, until curved swords like the talwar finally became the preferred option by the Mughals of the 16th century. So how was the Khanda used then? Well, unlike other swords, it was more of a brute force weapon. With the blade averaging around 30 inches, it's somewhere between a short sword and a long sword, and the wide blade is meant to make the weapon heavier to deliver stronger blows. The rib on the side was made to strengthen the blade, as well as using it to choke up on the blade to even further increase your cutting power. You could say it's kind of used like an axe in that it's meant for hacking at opponents instead of slashing and thrusting. And with that in mind, it was often a last resort weapon, with warriors taking out their khanda when surrounded by enemies and wildly striking their opponents with large two-handed swings to take down as many as possible before falling. Because of all this, I think it's a super unique weapon and a great one to start off on. Next is the katar, or as it's known in the original Tamil, katari, meaning dagger. The katar is something that most people have probably seen before. It's incredibly common in movies and especially video games, probably because it's just so cool, but historically it was also super effective. While we originally believed this weapon to have originated in the 16th century with the Mughals, new evidence may suggest it's existed since the 10th century. Regardless, this little guy became incredibly popular because it was just so effective at close quarters combat. The design is unique amongst daggers in that instead of a regular hilt, it has a horizontal grip, putting the blade in line with your arm. Because of this, the most effective way to attack with the Katar is basically just boxing. This is a lot more powerful than stabbing or slashing with a regular dagger because the movement uses more strength from more muscles. You can put more weight into your strikes, and you can be more precise. The main goal of the Katar was to find and penetrate openings or weak spots in armor, and its design makes it perfect at that job. Speaking of design, there were actually a lot of variations on this weapon. Some were short, some were long, some were straight, some were curved. Apparently there were even wavy ones, a blade style known as the flamberge. This is because blades were reused a lot, and the blades of old swords were often refitted onto Katars, giving them a wide range of variety. My favorite is this one. While there's a near 100% chance that this was purely ceremonial and was never meant to see the battlefield, its design is just beautiful. Impractical, but beautiful. Moving on, now we have the Vajramushti, which I teased in the opening, and this actually has a really interesting name. Coming from Sanskrit, mushti means closed hand or fist, and Vajra has a dual meaning of thunderbolt and diamond, meant to symbolize the coalescence of indestructibility and overwhelming power, kind of like the adage of an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. Together, Vajramushti means thunder fist or diamond fist. But to get back on track, the Vajramushti is basically a form of brass knuckles. Typically, they just had small spikes on the front, but more deadly versions were made with long dagger-like blades coming out of each side as well. These were not typically weapons of war, but instead were to be used in full-contact wrestling matches. Those that practiced the art were called Jeshtimala, meaning the most excellent wrestlers, and they wore a single Vajramushti on their right hand while grappling. This weapon could date back as far as the Maurya dynasty in 300 BC, but our greatest source of knowledge about it comes from a text known as the Malapurana, meaning the ancient stories of wrestling. This book probably dates to the 17th or 18th century, but it's a compendium of knowledge that has been passed down from centuries before, describing in great detail the diets, training, and techniques of Jeshtimala fighters and the Vajramushti. The sport is incredibly brutal, with few restrictions. Fighters employ vicious strikes with the Vajramushti, as well as wrestling and grappling similar to modern-day Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In this image, you can see a Jeshtimala fighter defeating his opponent with a move very similar to an omoplata in Jiu-Jitsu. And this sport wasn't restricted to only men. There's actually plenty of accounts of women using the Vajramushti and becoming Jeshtimala, like Haryaka, who you can see here being depicted defeating a man in combat. While the Vajramushti was not a military weapon, its impact on Indian culture and martial arts cannot be overstated. The Jeshtimala were very highly renowned and held a great position in society, and their descendants still practice it today, keeping this beautiful ancient martial art alive. Next is the Bagnak, which could be seen as a cousin to the Vajramushti. While the Vajramushti was not a military weapon, mainly being used in sport, the Bagnak was very popular to have both on and off the battlefield. The name directly translates to tiger claw, and that's exactly what it is. It's extremely effective at close range on lightly armored opponents, but obviously becomes useless once there's distance between you and the target. So on the battlefield, it was likely used as a last resort. Alternatively, it was commonly used in assassinations due to its ease of concealment. Famously, the ruler of the Marathan Empire, Shivaji Bhonsali I, used a Bagnak to assassinate the general of the Bijapur Sultanate, Afzal Khan, during a peace talk. These claws would also sometimes be dipped in poison just to make sure the job got done. This specific one from the Science Museum group even had an attached dagger, sometimes known as a bichua, which means scorpion sting. However, the Bagnak was arguably more popular off of the battlefield. They could be used very effectively by thieves and ruffians in street fights, or by regular people who just want to defend themselves. Particularly, women would often carry these for protection when traveling. Ultimately, the Bagnak ended up getting a bad reputation as a dirty weapon for assassins and thieves, but regardless, most people had one, because you'd rather be caught in a dark alley with it than without it. Up next is probably the strangest weapon I'll talk about today, and it's one that I didn't even know existed prior to researching for this video. This is the Urumi. It's essentially a whip sword, a somewhat popular idea in anime and video games, but not something that I imagined could actually be done in real life. But evidence shows that ancient Indians first created this weapon sometime between 400 and 100 BC, during the Mauryan Empire. Its design is a flat, sharpened sheet of metal that's extremely flexible, attached to a hilt, and some Urumi even had multiple blades, kind of like a cat o' nine tails. The weapon likely wasn't used much in warfare, and therefore would have been lost to time if it hadn't been picked up by a martial art known as Kalaripayattu, which is believed to be one of the oldest surviving martial arts in the world. This art is still practiced in India today, and the use of the Urumi is restricted only to those who have demonstrated total mastery in the art. Now, as flashy and cool weapons go, this has to take the cake, but I'm not sure how useful it would actually be. Sure, getting whipped by a sheet of metal would hurt like hell, but the added weight of the steel over a conventional whip would hamper its travel speed, and the larger surface area of the impact point would reduce the total force being applied. I also don't see much benefit of making it bladed. The fact that it's wielded as a whip means that edge alignment would be nearly impossible to guarantee. You might get lucky and manage to slice your opponent a few times, but most of the time I feel like you would just be spanking them with a metal sheet. While I'm not a master of Kalaripayattu, I would dare to say that a regular old whip would probably be more effective than the Urumi in true combat. Chakram are another weapon that a lot of people have probably seen in pop culture, but probably assume wasn't a real historical weapon. In actuality though, the chakram was very widespread in ancient and medieval India. Originating at least as far back as the 5th century BC, it was primarily a projectile weapon similar to a throwing knife or a shuriken. The most popular method of using the chakram was the Tajani method, whereby you twirl the chakram on one finger, building up speed, and then launch it with a flick of the wrist. However, you could also spin your arm and launch it underhand, similarly to a softball pitch, for more force at a shorter distance. Supposedly, highly skilled chakram users are capable of hitting targets accurately up to 100 meters away using the Tajani method. There are also smaller versions of chakram meant to be worn around the wrist as a bracelet so that you can slice up your opponent in hand-to-hand combat, as well as larger versions worn around the neck or fitted to turbans to serve a similar purpose. When used like this, it's a pretty brutal and gruesome weapon. Though, on the other hand, it's also an extremely important image in Hinduism, as it's the weapon of the god Vishnu, one of Hinduism's 3 pillar deities. Vishnu is the god of preservation and frequently comes to Earth to fight away evil and maintain balance. Vishnu's chakram is also known as the Sudarshan chakram, and while I've seen a few translations of this floating around, it roughly means disc of divine vision, so think like clairvoyance. Vishnu acquired this after consulting the god Shiva about how to destroy demons that were attacking the gods. Shiva was deep in meditation at this time, so Vishnu had to show an act of devotion to wake him up. He decided to gather 1,000 blooming lotuses, but after realizing he was one short, he offered his own eye in place of the flower. Seeing this act of devotion moved Shiva to bestow the Sudarshan chakram to Vishnu, which he then used to destroy the demons. Alright, I may have gotten a little off track there with the chakram lore, but I learned so much about Indian culture and Hinduism while researching this that I just wanted to share a little bit of it. If you don't know anything about Hinduism, I would definitely recommend reading into it. It's super fascinating. But to close out this segment, the chakram was a very deadly weapon, both at range and in close quarters, and it makes sense why it has become so popular in fiction recently. The final weapon I'll be talking about today is a special one, my second favorite historical weapon besides the halberd. It is the pata. The pata, or gauntlet sword, is an incredibly unique weapon, so much so that India is the only place they've ever been seen, at least as far as we know. You may notice the similarity to the Katar from earlier, both having H-shaped grips, resulting in the blade being in line with your arm. But the Pata takes it one step further, being a full-length sword instead of a measly dagger. Its gauntlet design provides great arm protection, but comes at the cost of extremely reduced mobility. With your wrist and forearm being locked to one orientation, it becomes impossible to do the flourishing motions common with other swords to produce torque and execute more powerful slashes. Instead, the user must spin their entire body to produce that same torque. It also becomes very hard to thrust because you're restricted to the motion of your forearm. In the end, this lack of mobility combined with the lack of a traditional crossguard makes the Pata very poor defensively, even despite the added protection of the gauntlet, as it's less equipped to catch and deflect incoming attacks which are likely targeting more vital areas like the chest or head instead of your arm. While almost every source I checked said that the Pata originated in the 16th century during the Mughal Empire, literally as I was researching this, an article was posted on Sword Encyclopedia about the Pata, claiming that new evidence suggests it's as old as the 12th century. While this wasn't cited, and I couldn't find anything to corroborate it, the author is supposedly a respected historian, so maybe he's got some juicy insider knowledge the public doesn't know yet, but take it with a grain of salt. Regardless of when it was created, it wasn't seen on battlefields until the 17th century, when the Marathan armies used them as anti-cavalry weapons, possibly because it would be easier to attack a mounted, moving target without losing your grip on the weapon when it's attached to your arm. Outside of this though, the Pata wasn't particularly popular. The time it took to learn how to wield the weapon effectively outweighed whatever advantage it gave over the conventional weapons of the time, like the talwar or the shamshir. Ultimately, it became more of a status symbol, showing off how good you were at sword fighting. We could see this from the highly decorated Pata that were made at the time, like this one at the Met, with beautiful gold patterns and inscriptions from the Quran along its edges. With all the interesting weapons I've talked about today, I feel like the Pata really exemplifies just how unique India was with its weapons. While it wasn't an amazing weapon of war, people to this day are drawn to it solely based on its uniqueness, which makes it even crazier that India was the only place to ever experiment with a gauntlet sword design. It's truly a testament to their creativity. So, I talked about a lot of really cool weapons today. Some well known, some not so well known, but they all had something unique that let them stand out from the rest of the medieval arsenal. Either they functioned a different way than conventional weapons of the time, they were culturally significant, or they were just so weird that they completely broke the mold. This was by no means an exhaustive list. Throughout history, there have been hundreds of different kinds of weapons that emerged in India, and every one of them could have had a full-length video about them. But these were just 7 that I think really exemplified the pure creativity the Indians had when it came to warfare. I really hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed researching and making it. And if you want more content like this, then please consider subscribing. Right now, I'm planning on making videos like this for African and South American weapons as well, and if you have any suggestions for other areas to explore, then please let me know in the comments. I always love learning new things, and I hope that I was able to teach you all something. That's all from me today. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.